We are going to be talking about how you find the information that matters when it matters in this session. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Amy Birkway. I'm Communications Director for Open Research at Springer Nature, but I'm here today in my capacity as one of the organisers of SpotOn. We have a very esteemed panel of people here to talk to us about the problems that you face when trying to find the research that you're looking for, and how you might go about doing that in the most efficient way. The stats that I have say that there are around 2.5 million journal articles published annually, I think, from around 9 million researchers. And that is just journal articles. That doesn't cover books, it doesn't cover data, it doesn't cover preprints. So you can start to see already the massive scale of the issue that we face when searching for the right research. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to somebody much more knowledgeable on this subject, who is Professor Jennifer Linden from UCL.
Thanks very much. So our brief for this was to introduce ourselves and then provide a bit of a 3-minute summary of what we're bringing to this panel. So I'm a professor of neuroscience at UCL. I've been in research for over 25 years now. I was horrified to realize when thinking about it for this panel. And I wanted to make 3 points about searches of the literature. The first is kind of aimed at the junior researchers here, which is that the problem, the struggle to keep on top of the literature does not go away as you get more experienced. Everybody I know who's at my level as senior academics is still struggling. Nobody thinks they have a really good solution. In fact, I think it gets worse as you become more senior because you're trying to manage multiple streams of research, and each of those streams has its own connections out into the literature. So the first is it's a kind of widespread problem, and it's not something you're going to figure out as you get farther along. The second point is that I think the strategies that most senior academics use now, including myself, are clearly suboptimal. I mean, I would say that the strategy that I use and most people I know use is a kind of unholy mix of the few journals by electronic tables of contents in email, and that we use for keeping on top of major trends in science and in our particular fields. Some mix of searches in various journal search facilities, Google Scholar for classics and highly cited articles, ISI Web of Science for more sophisticated forward and backward citation tracking, and PubMed obviously for more recent articles. But speaking as a senior scientist, and I think this is also true for everyone else I know, it tends to be very paper-driven and problem-driven. It's the ideal of spending every Monday morning doing a little update on the recent literature works for about a week, and then a grant deadline intervenes. So there's clear problems with this approach. It's very limited to the journals one's chosen to watch regularly and the keywords one is using to search. That is extremely limited, and it's an increasing problem, I think, because of the importance of interdisciplinary research. The reliance on choosing keywords only works if you know what the keywords are for the problem you're interested in the other fields that might have insights to help you. So I think it's really a seriously suboptimal traditional approach. And that brings me to the third point I want to make, is that there's really clearly scope for better approaches using more sophisticated machine learning techniques to recommend articles, or crowdsourcing. I know I've tried some of the recommendation services offered by Faculty of 1,000 and been really, really impressed. They've been really very helpful. So I wanted to close close my part with passing on to the people who are going to tell you about better methods than the kind of traditional old school approach that I just described.
Thank you. Hello guys, my name is Mauro. I am one of the 3 co-founders of a young startup called Researchably. So today Researchably is a search tool for biomedical startups and consultants, but it started just over a year ago as a side project with me and a housemate. We started knowing very, very little of the technical challenges that we were going to face and the nuances of the problem of research discovery. So it's been all about learning and experimenting from day one. Over this past year, we've studied the search habits of 200 researchers, everything from academic researchers to researchers in biomedical startups and big pharma. We launched and tested 2 prototypes, which saw about 5,000 downloads, and now we're piloting a new product, working with a handful of biotech startups, and basically just helping them find, filter, analyze, and put to use all the papers, clinical trials, patents, and market information that they need to bring their projects to life. So when we started this project, it was really just with the mission of creating what we call the ultimate scientific search engine. Needless to say, it's easier said than done, as I'm sure you guys know. We're still very far from doing that, but today we're looking for more biotech startups to pilot our product. So if you guys work in one or you know someone that might be interested, come talk to me afterwards. And just to wrap up my little short intro, I want to do a big shout out to Digital Science because we were one of their Catalyst Grant winners this year, and it's been really, really helpful. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. So thank you to you guys.
Thank you. For people who were here in the last session, you have heard quite a lot from me already. Just a little background about Sparrow. We were founded actually in Cambridge in 2013. The story goes, and I'm not one of the co-founders, so I'm just retelling the story. The story goes that there was a very helpful postdoc called Steve within the co-founders lab, and she would get these emails like every 4 to 6 days from Steve, just going, you should read this paper because I don't know if it's related, but it seems tangentially related. You should read it. And over the course of her PhD, she found that that was consistently the best way to find new papers. So at that point, machine learning was becoming a little bit more popular, and she had the luck of meeting somebody who was a machine learning specialist. So they came together and tried to essentially engineer Steve. Is it possible to engineer a software that could act like a human being and recommend you tangentially related things that you wouldn't have thought about reading, and from journals you wouldn't have thought about tracking? So that was really the start of Sparrow, and then since then we've been looking at this from a technology point of view, but also from a human perspective, because ultimately, if you get garbage in, you get garbage out, and if we don't involve the human expert in the system and really harness that expertise they're going to bring in when they're looking at things and they're making connections, these non-linear connections between different articles. If we can't harness that, then the system is just a very, very smart calculator, and we didn't want to build that. So a large part of what I'm doing right now is to work out how we can incentivize people to be part of that wider recommendation community, if you want to call it that. And actually, Dan put it really well. It's a crowdsourced recommendation system. How can we get people who are, in this part of the world working on something, help them, recommend something to another lab group who might be in a different institute, in a different discipline altogether? How can we actually surface these different connections in a way that is not going to overwhelm people, but also be really helpful? A very difficult thing. I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, so I'm Dan Shanahan, and I must admit I'm actually really jealous of the nanochemist superpower, because I'm more than a little bit worried I'm going to brain myself on this as this goes on. So if I suddenly fall unconscious, bear with me. So very similar to Sparrow, actually. What we do at F1000 is a form of almost marrying human curation with machine learning. So as Jennifer touched on, if you know the right keywords, you can maybe find the research, but then you're very much researching on what an article is about or a preprint is about. You're not going to be able to find all these subjective things like, oh, it was a breakthrough, or it's got this very interesting method that was applied in a completely different context but you could use. So what we try and do is we have approved experts, is really what we call them, so faculty members, and they recommend research, but very much on the point of view of it is of interest. And we leave it that generic, because all it means is you should read this. And when they recommend something, they give it a series of classifications which are trying to capture in a snapshot what it is about the research that's of interest. So it's things like it's got a novel method, or it's got robust data, or it's good for teaching. And this is then appended to the metadata. So it helps us capture that little bit of subjectivity around an article recommendation. And they also turn around and they announce which area they work in. So we can work out that the article's of interest to that area. So if, for example, you're a chemical biologist and you recommend a software engineering article, we can then tag that software engineering article as of interest to chemical biologists. So this kind of more nuanced recommendation can then be brought into the metadata that we can then use to try and surface it in a similar way to what Mauro's doing with Researchably. And it's how we're trying to bring it up to people's attention. I mean, obviously there are two big limitations, I would say, of our system. So the first thing is there's just no way to be completely systematic. You know, I calculated it slightly differently from Amy, but it could be the same figure, that about 14,000 articles are published a day. So from PubMed, it's about 3,500, and I shudder to think how many people we would need to read every single one of those daily and actually have a systematic approach to it. But that's not necessarily a complete problem with research discovery. And the other big issue is it is quite difficult to scale. So we have over 8,000 faculty members covering the life sciences. So if we want to move into physics, for example, we're going to need another 4,000 at least, and so on and so forth. But it's an example of how we're trying to sort of combine the two, because we don't yet feel technology's there to do the more subjective elements. However, I'll be now handing over to Rabia, who hopefully can talk to that one as well.
My name's Rabia. I'm a researcher, an exploratory scientist at Benevolent AI. And Benevolent AI is an in silico drug discovery company where we believe that $2 billion and 10 years to bring a drug to market is actually just not going to work for the type of diseases we're dealing with. And so how do you solve that? Because when you have to bring a drug to market, let's say I want to go work on osteoporosis, I need to go read these X thousand papers that are coming out on a daily basis to understand what are the new pathways that are important, how do I drug those pathways, what are the new targets, how do I write patents in those pathways, so mining patent data, understanding what the clinical trials are in osteoporosis, who are the companies that are important in this ecosystem, what are the omics signatures, how do we run a clinical trial, and all of that information needs to be in front of me, and I need to make decisions on that much faster than we can do it today, because 10 years is just not good enough. So what we believe at Benevolent is that we can actually use things like machine learning, a lot of relationship inference tools to say we're going to read these millions and millions of articles, and we're going to harness that data and produce it in a way for the researchers, so exploratory scientists like myself, that can digest that data and bring new targets to market or repurpose drugs at a much faster pace. And so our goal really is to say we need to find a way to make this data more accessible. We need to be able to mine it better. We need to tag it better. We need to understand these connections that are not obvious, because you can only tag things that you know. What about all the things you don't know? What about all of the entities that we haven't thought about, or just emerging entities, words? Like autophagy was a term that was coined at one point, but it didn't exist before, it exists now. How do we build algorithms to recognize that so humans don't have to recognize it? And the humans in our company spend our time thinking about how do we take something new to market faster, rather than thinking about how do I find the right paper. And we're hoping AI is really going to solve finding the right paper, and we're going to spend our brain capacity designing the right experiments to make sure when the drug does hit a patient, it's much more likely to work. And that's how we're using the scientific literature for in silico drug discovery at Benevolent.
Thank you very much, everybody, for outlining your own solutions to the problem. I'd like to turn it on its head a little bit and ask how, and continuing a theme from the research integrity session next door, how do you avoid fake news, and how do you filter out the research that perhaps people should not be trying to find or relying on?
I mean, I have a very short answer on our side, and is that we're building a huge database of known fake news sources. So that's one of the ways that we're thinking of tackling that, but that's kind of a cheap step. Do you have a better answer?
I think one answer, maybe not the one you were looking for, is that you need to educate people about the scientific process. You need them to understand that something that is published is not the end of that work. It's not necessarily unretractable. It's not necessarily the full story. And also the way that papers are currently published, there's a lot of, there's very little context about how that is, how that piece of work fits within the larger, maybe the decade of work that has gone before it. Very much references probably, the more recent events in the field, but not sort of further afield. And that's one of the things that I think is more important to think about, and less about sort of obsessing about the idea that something is fake or that you must delete all of those things from existence, because you cannot. And you have to rely on actually people having a more nuanced understanding about the information they're getting from the internet, and also the types of sources they should be reading from. And also that, I agree with you that the sources are important, and we also verify all our sources, but you cannot just say that this source is verifiable, therefore all of the stuff in there is true. We all know that there are retractions and fraudulent cases. So I would argue that this is a much larger question than in the technology.
I think Sibyl's give it in very much similar to what my answer would be, in that we verify our sources, and rather than just sort of throwing the gates open and saying anyone can recommend, the main reason we curate is we know exactly who the person doing the recommending is. So you can at least make sure it's not, I know, someone like me masquerading as Jennifer and pretending I know what I'm talking about. It's actually the researcher who we think it is. But yeah, we can't capture data fabrication, data falsification. We do actually have articles that have been recommended, and then later something's come to light and it's been retracted, and we obviously flag it up. This is additional information and it's made available. But I think there is a mechanism between, as Sibyl said, it shouldn't be just final. Once it's been recommended, this is part of an ongoing process. This is ongoing evaluation. And by flagging it up, we expect further discussion, further evaluation to happen. So it's more about trying to put this out there to make more people give the information back, so we have something more to know.
I'll just add to that to say, I think at Benevolent what we do is the amount of data supporting a specific hypothesis, right? So if you do have some kind of, some news, whether it's a research article that says A influences B and everything else in the literature database says actually that's not true. So you can use the sheer quantity of data surrounding something to push down or weight down a specific, whether it's fake or not, I think becomes irrelevant, because if it does not in the scientific literature garner enough evidence, theoretically over time it will lose traction, although we've seen that not to be true in other cases. But that's how we tackle it, but I don't think there's one solution to that problem.
Yeah, from the kind of a traditionalist approach, I would say I would come back to research integrity, and for the scientists themselves, junior or senior, not recommending something or tweeting about it or telling somebody about it unless you've actually read it thoroughly and carefully and actually are sure it's right. And as an American, I have somewhat of an ambivalent attitude toward Twitter, but I've seen colleagues in my own institution tweeting out something about a paper that just came out in Science that they can't possibly have read because it just came out that day, but the headline looks really interesting. Don't tweet about it if you haven't actually read it, because it could be completely wrong. So I think I would come back to research integrity at the base for the scientists themselves. We're all in a rush, and it's easy to get a little bit of extra attention on Twitter by talking about something you saw in a headline. But if you don't know it's good, don't take it for granted that because it's in Nature or Science that it is.
Especially if it's a natural science.
Yes.
Are there any questions from the floor at this stage?
You talked about keyword searching. What about the application of keywords by researchers? How much do you think that is a problem? By they give it little thought or incorrect keyword use.
Oh yes, definitely. It's also non-standardized. They spell it wrong. To clarify, I'm sure it's the same for everyone. When we say keywords, we mine the literature ourselves and add keywords from an established taxonomy. Because, yeah, if you look at, we try and incorporate the keywords researchers have given, because it does help, and sometimes they manage to add something in that we wouldn't have, particularly if they've got access to the full text. But basically, we have a list of full text articles, normally open access ones, that have been manually curated, and we've added in the keywords, and then we kind of compare what we have to these and add and remove keywords to try and build this profile. But it's all done using computers and using established taxonomies for the exact reason you've said. And it leads to the good question, why journals want you to add keywords then, but I'll leave that to someone else.
I mean, on the topic of keywords, I think the problem generally is not that there aren't enough keywords. Not that there are too many keywords, but the fact that there are not enough, and also not enough variations of what people might call things, especially in emerging fields. If you've got two competing keywords, and I've been in the situation where my supervisor really wanted to name something, you know, a certain way, and he wanted that abbreviation, but ultimately the rest of the field went with another, you know, then our stuff gets really difficult to find because we went with that abbreviation. So I think for us, it's about expanding that pool, you know, making sure that whenever we start to analyze and tag a paper, that whatever possible keyword that is relevant, we're able to attach it to that paper, whether it, you know, across all different sources, so whether it's from the journal itself or from PubMed. I think the more we can gather, the better.
So at Benevolent, that's one of our largest challenges, actually. And so one of the things that I find interesting is the amount of spelling errors you find in papers, right? Because a keyword direct match only works unless you've made a spelling error writing that. And so what I've realized is this world of biocuration is actually incredibly important, and people sitting down and saying this new term is emerging and it is something important, and we have to integrate it into ontologies that are standardized across. Something like mesh becomes really important because that's how most of us will do keyword matching. So keywords are important, but they can only be used as good as either the NLP is on the AI side or ontologies are on another side. So.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think this is one of those areas where machine learning in particular can really, you know, bring an edge. We try to experiment as much as possible with topic modeling, which I'm sure you guys do as well, to stay away from keyword-based search. Also, just anecdotal, interesting story. As a part of kind of our experimenting, we worked directly with a couple startups, basically behaving as their search box. So they would send us their queries, and we would have to reply to those. And it's really incredible how much people suck at formulating search queries. Even people doing systematic reviews, you know, that they're supposed to have them written down, and you know, there's discrepancies in how things are written down. And so yeah, it's just one of those problems that as soon as someone builds that magic box that just understands exactly what you want, then it's going to be great. Hopefully it's us.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, writing articles, I always feel traumatized by trying to choose the keywords. I think this really should be immediately replaced with at least like word cloud based on the paper. There's really no need for it in an age of machine learning.
There's a question right at the back up there.
I can hold up. Regarding fake news, and it's interesting that you all use artificial intelligence and machine learning, which has a certain kind of properties to this technology. But I was thinking about, I'm a part of a blockchain technology company that have different types of properties to its technology that's perhaps more well suited to combat fake news in pictures and videos. So if you want to talk to me later, give me your business card, and then we can take it from there, and I can let you know a little bit more about the work.
I have another question. From the machine learning aspect over to the human aspect that a couple of you picked up on, how do you source your experts and the people who do give you human recommendations, and how does that work?
I guess we all have a bit of a human aspect to what we do, but at different levels. For us, it has been mainly actually about, since we're still at a sort of experimental level of thinking what algorithms are actually viable and which are not. So we're doing it at a small scale. For example, what we do is if we run a search query for a systematic review, we'll compare what the model filters out versus what the human actually filters out. And so that's the sort of human curation level that we have, but it's not actually to the extent that we have to go out looking for experts. It's more of that we're working at a small scale with a small number of experts, and then hopefully we can scale that in the future.
Well, actually, our policy is not at the moment to have a policy on who's allowed to curate stuff on Sparrow. I think one of the big themes that came out of the earlier sessions is that there are a lot of people who don't have PhDs or an academic affiliation who can be considered experts. And I think, especially in industry or actually a lot of patient sort of advocacy bodies, there's a lot of knowledge out there that isn't captured within the academic institute. So we don't have a policy right now to say, well, if you don't have an academic address, you can't curate. Obviously, we have to educate the user base that, everything that's posted here is posted by a user who may or may not have an academic affiliation or the requisite training to understand the papers. So I think it goes back to Jennifer's point that we have to rely on integrity. We have to rely on users being able to say, I'm going to put my face and my name to this. Therefore, I'm going to set a standard for myself. And I don't want to be the propagator of fake news. And malicious things will happen. And therefore, we just have a very laborious manual screening process at the moment. Once we get more technologists on the question, I think we can definitely find more systematic ways to flag stuff that might be dubious. But at the moment, it's very manual.
So I now just wonder if we're either cynical or have no faith in humanity. But we do quite a lot of work for the curation. And it's a really, really interesting question, actually, because ours is not so much how you find people, it's who is the best place to recommend something. So currently we try, I don't want to turn around and say we definitely have this, we try and have a bit of a balance. Because you've got your big professors, your Nobel Prize winners, etc., who everyone's heard of. But I would argue that actually most of these people aren't best placed to recommend the literature, because they're too busy, they can't read much. And you need this balance of having the more senior researchers who've got the experience, as Jennifer said, and sort of know about it and know the research integrity. And then you want them to work together with the more junior researchers, both as a training, but also because the more junior researchers normally have a slightly broader overview. They haven't specialized to quite the same level yet, they read more. So currently we use an interesting, very weighted term there, an interesting model which is almost a hierarchical system similar to journals. So we have people who are very senior and quite knowledgeable at the top, and they work almost as a sort of filter mechanism. So we have people nominating or are nominated, and then we check who they are, we check who they say they are, and almost have a conversation with these more senior people going, do they have the right experience, yes or no? Now, we're not going to pretend this is perfect, it's working to date, but we're actually actively looking and experimenting with other ways of doing this, particularly to get more representation in. Because there's been quite a lot of research that shows if you ask for nominations, you get a rather specific demographic, which tends to be older, white, male, and American. So it's a balance, and we're trying to work out how to do this. So we're looking to tapping into communities and working with sort of academic societies and working with interest groups and working with patient advocates and trying to expand this. But it is the single most challenging thing I would say we do, is exactly this. It's how to find people, how to get them involved, and how to make sure they are who they say they are and they're doing what they say they do.
I mean, we don't really curate literature. I mean, that the tech is responsible for that. But similar to what you said, we have a massive drug discovery team. And Benevolence made a really interesting effort to hire people that are highly experienced. So we have people 10 years pharma experience that will know in depth, this is a calcium ion subunit XYZ, and they've done that for 10 years. And then there's people like me coming in with a postdoc, a PhD, and a couple of years in tech. And we work with each other to try and understand that's domain expertise. This is, how do we leverage the tech, and how can we bring those two types of knowledge groups together to really, when a new paper does come out and shows up on our platform, is it relevant? Is the person who wrote it, useful, or have they just published 4 papers that have been retracted in the past, which you only know because you've been in the field long enough to be able to say that. So Although we don't have human curation, our company is structured such that we bring in two aspects very similar to what you just mentioned.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? I think everyone does. We have one in the middle there, though.
So just on the topic of fake news, the way that I like to look at it is it's false positives, right, in science. But we tend to think about fake news as intentional, and sometimes there's unintentional fake news as well, right? Propagations from source that then gets obviously published in articles in that. My question is, what I've found in my experience is even with manual curation of benchmarks to try and test whether something's correct or not, we find that even manual curation has its own issues, and there's actually a lot of false positives in that as well. So, you know, the question is, how do you address this unintentional fake news, or is that something that is kind of looked at across, you know, your guys' industries as well? Because my feeling is that machine learning can actually apply there, because you can train a model to do that probably better than what most humans can. But it's actually identifying the source itself, which is the issue, because sometimes that gets propagated.
Maybe I can take an example from Facebook, which we don't like, but you know, one of the things that they did as part of the fake news issue was that if things are being shared without being clicked through, you know, if a link to a particular article is being shared, and it seems that people have caught on to the headline and they like it, therefore they're sharing it, but not actually read the thing. They actually have algorithms now to depress those in your newsfeed. I agree that there's definitely ways that machine learning can help with propagation. I think you can definitely write algorithms to pick out cases where something is sort of spreading a bit too quickly for it to be right. But I think, you know, as we've all said, you know, it's really hard to identify at source something that may be unintentionally fake. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
I think it's also interesting because it comes back to machine learning can help, but it depends what you train your algorithms on. And we've established I'm the cynic here, but frankly, I would say that the published literature has appalling publication bias. We know this. So if you've trained your algorithms on something with such appalling bias, I don't think that they can overcome that, because it becomes very, very difficult. And you're right, false positives. We've had decades of positive being the only way to go, and it's very recent that it's changed. So we can do weighting depending on age, etc. But that's almost why we're trying to combine the both. The other thing that we can do is look at what the source is. So, I mean, I know we're not to pick on Nature at all, because I think they genuinely do quite a good job, but they are aiming for a very specific type of publication. Compared that with PLOS ONE, who are aiming for a slightly different type of publication. If you're sort of using our algorithms are blind to where it's published or where it's been disseminated from once it's in that group, so it allows us to remove certain biases, but things like false positive results or just dissemination bias and publication bias are actually going to be made more severe by algorithms because it's all we can train it on.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to say about this is that the analogy to fake news only goes so far because in the political domain, I mean, we've had all these cases of obviously false things, right? And what we're talking about here is more kind of a kind of more subtle failure where maybe the author didn't even realize it and it was just a little sloppy and it requires more critical thinking. So maybe the right solution is just to make sure that there's an open process for commenting on these things as they're kind of distributed, and that those comments and criticisms, which would be the essence of a critical analysis of that work, are propagated as much as the original headline. I think that's the key thing that's missing, is that the corrections and the criticisms and the kind of second thoughts don't get publicized as much as the initial headline. And you might be able to make political analogies to that too.
We had a question from the gent in the white T-shirt there, I think.
Yes. So it was semi-question, semi-comment. I'm drawing parallels to sort of what you're talking about with drawing out the false positives. So, you know, I've worked with sort of transcriptomic data sets myself, and so you get this big list of genes, for example, and, you know, and that is going to, if you say, for example, use gene ontology by Thomson Reuters, that's going to be heavily biased towards things like, you know, like P53 and NF-kappa B, really heavily cited proteins. But also you get these lists of really unknown things coming through. You get transcripts which haven't actually been annotated yet. So, you know, it's a similar kind of problem that you've got from a human point of view, because you're going, well, you know, I want my project to be believed by my fellow community, so I might just go and work on P53 and NF-kappa B because you know, it's kind of like your shit falls into the right story. Everyone's going to sort of like be like, yeah, it's joining the party. If you go for something really sort of like unknown, it's a bit of a risk. So it seems to be a question of balancing that risk. You know, as a scientist, you're like, well, I want to have a career. I need a job. I need funding. You know, how do I optimize that myself by doing, you know, do I take the safe route, for example, or do I take a risky route? You know, so I guess it was more of a comment. I guess having that analogy. So you know, the AI is having the similar problems as an individual. I think it's an interesting sort of problem, and whether or not, you know, like what it comes down to at the end for me just seems to be a case of, you know, cultural shift, for example, to sort of like push the more risky projects, for example, or, you know, push people to do something a bit more interested. Maybe the funding bodies need to sort of like say, yeah, we're going to fund more risky projects. I don't know.
I mean, I think the answer to that is that thanks to projects like Crossref, which we heard from earlier today, and then people like Sparrow, you know, making that more discoverable, then people have the opportunity to actually discover those, you know, hidden gems and decide to play with them. So I guess, yeah, be brave and play with them. That's the cool thing to do.
Maybe taking a note from tech startups as a whole, I think the reason why riskier projects aren't funded is that, you know, there's so much aversion to failure, you know, and this is something, you know, to the positive results. If your publication publishes something that is a negative result and it's not seen as valuable as a positive result, then therefore, you know, you would go for the thing that has more chance of getting a positive result because you want a career and, you know, you need to live. So, you know, I think it might be a larger systematic issue with the way publications and you know, funding is allocated. So yeah, we would like to tackle it. I'm not sure we can do it alone.
I think you actually hit on, for me, what is almost the key of the issue, which is this needs culture change or behavior change, as well as, you know, AI is not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to suddenly make everything better. And actually, within F1000, we view our efforts towards discovery as complementary to efforts towards dissemination. And I think most people are quite familiar with the F1000 research platforms like Wellcome Open Research Gates. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change publishing, discovery, dissemination, communication, whatever you want to call it, in multiple ways that we view as complementary. So at one end, you're sitting there saying, right, this should be disseminated first, peer-reviewed in the open, indexed later, etc. So that way, we've got no publication bias. Now, the problem that creates is there's a lot of rubbish. So the corollary of that is what we're talking about today, which is then how do you, from all of that stuff, find the right, good, interesting, valuable research? And to my mind, these two are intrinsically linked and very important. But the current mechanism of just publishing it in a journal, which packages this all together in a black box, doesn't tell you anything about it, but tells you not to worry, love, they've got it sorted, is wrong. And we're trying to sit there and go, get it out there first, get the things that are so niche that no one cares about. It's irrelevant, no one cares. We don't mind about citations. If it's relevant to you and it's out there, we can find it. But it's got to be out there first, and we've got to help you find it. And that's very much my view.
So it's funny you talk about that problem because that's something I'm struggling with at work. So how do you control for something like P53 when you're trying to mine the literature and everything is linked to P53 at some point? What is really exciting is open data repositories, where I'm not interested in what you think the result of your RNA-seq data was because you had to publish in Nature and you can only publish with P53 in Nature. You actually did find this other interesting thing, and bioRxiv and similar data repositories are allowing people to highlight things that they think are really interesting, may not get that high impact publication because no one wants to work on that one transcript that you can't map. But really, from a drug discovery perspective, that is the most interesting thing, because the druggable genome is being worked on by all of the big pharma. So if we want to compete, how do we compete in the non-well-researched areas? So depositing RNA-seq data for other people to play around with, finding the same things you did, but also putting something on bioRxiv, because you know what, it's really exciting, and I'm going to put it out there, and maybe that gets a much bigger altmetric score than any Nature publication citation. And I think junior researchers moving forward are putting a lot of weight on that. You know, how is your article getting traction, irrespective of where it was published? So that's one approach.
In the couple of minutes we've got left, I'd like to ask our panel to comment on if you were approached by a colleague, perhaps, or a researcher who is really struggling with this, and you have to give them one practical tip for finding the best research and to finding the stuff that's relevant for them. What's the one practical tip that you would give? I know that's really difficult, so apologies.
I would probably say ask somebody working in the field. And I would, unfortunately, I would say that because I would say that that person is likely to give you information that's not even going to be accessible through the most sophisticated pattern recognition algorithm, which is information about which labs that person who's been in the field considers most reliable. And I'm not sure it's ever going to be. I mean, that's the kind of thing that people learn in their PhDs and postdocs in a field. I'm not sure it's ever going to be that tractable to get at in an automated way.
I guess from studying the researchers that we worked with, what we saw be the most successful is having a very static workflow of looking for things. So maybe just knowing that you use 3 tools and exactly how you use them, and like experimenting with those enough until you are like, okay, I know these really well. And that could be anything from going through Twitter and PubMed and XYZ thing, but it's just the consistency. We saw that leading to people being very effective at finding what they're looking for.
Yeah, I would agree with the sort of routine aspect. I know not often you can get that chance to establish it. One of the conversations I had with a UCL professor who was very keen to improve actually reading habits for undergraduates recently. I think for him, he actually split up the research, sort of the literature research method into 2 things. You need to be able to see what's newest, but you also actually, before that, need to know what the classics are. And unfortunately, you can go to Google Scholar and you can see what's been most cited, but that's not really the only measure of how something becomes a classic, and actually not necessarily what is relevant right now. You know, it might have been a classic maybe 10 years ago. Is it still a classic now? And so there's no going around just talking to people. And I think that's the thing. You know, we try to build all these sophisticated systems and hide behind them. And that's really frustrating, because why have global connectivity and refuse to talk to each other? That's where I would be.
I think I agree quite a lot. I think Jennifer really hit the nail on the head for me, but I'm going to try a different piece of advice just for sake of variety. The one thing I would say is that we've also done quite a lot of research into this discovery process, and I would say work out why you're trying to search for something. Because in doing this, we found there are almost different levels that you're searching for. So there's, at its core, you're looking for something very, very, very specific. Now, be that to support a point you've made, to just know everything on your one genome that you're following, where there's not going to be much. There's one method for that that's going to be superior. You've then got to trying to find things in the tangential areas that are perhaps influential but not directly on your topic. That's a different approach. And then if you're looking for something that's just too popular to miss, that's again a different approach. And what we saw was a lot of people, so I suppose I'm almost directly disagreeing with Maura actually. We saw a lot of people try to use the exact same 3 tools to do everything. And fundamentally, a search engine's brilliant if you're searching for something. Search engines are useless if you're not really sure what you're looking for. So you've got to work out what it is. And if you're not sure what you're looking for, ask someone or find something that does it. If you know what you're looking for, use a search engine. So just almost take that step back, work out why you're doing it, and then take it from there rather than just barreling on ahead without thinking.
I would agree with that and say find a key opinion leader and go ask them, you know, like, where do I go for information on this topic? Because currently I cannot think of one tool that would replace some of the senior drug discoverers we have in our company, and the knowledge that they carry. As much as we want to replicate their brain in some AI tool that we're trying to build, I can guarantee you that that has not happened yet. So my solution for this problem is to go to one of our senior drug discovery scientists and say, I'm really trying to solve this. What do you think? And they'll be like, oh yes, you know, 10 years ago someone thought about that, and you're like, great, I would have never known that. So for me, that's still finding someone in the space.
So to sum up, for those of you who've walked in at the end, we had lots of exciting explanation of new tech, including, you know, artificial intelligence and machine learning, combined with there's really no equivalent of just finding somebody who's very knowledgeable and asking them. Thank you very much.